Hello and welcome to another episode of I Miss Book Club. My name is Veronica Reynolds and I'm happy today to welcome another guest host. With me today is Brian Jennings, the head of adult services at our library. Thanks for joining me today, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Veronica.
So as you know, I have to subject all of my guest hosts to one important question before we get into the meat of the matter. And it really is going to be some discussion about meat today. So I think that's even more accurate than usual. But I just want to ask you, what is a book that made you?
I would say a book that made me is Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, because I read that at a time just after college. I had a job, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I had a degree in history, and when I was in high school, I had a teacher, Mr. Krupa, for AP American Literature, and he compared every book we read to Grapes of Wrath.
I love that.
And he drew a big circle on the board. This was American Society, and then a little circle with the Joads and their dog. And a group of us always kind of made fun of him and said, "Oh, crazy Mr. Krupa." None of us read Grapes of Wrath. So I was looking at in a bookstore, and I found a leather-bound copy of Grapes of Wrath, cheap. And I said, you know what? I ought to read this. I had just actually run into Mr. Krupa, who at the time I had him, I think he retired after that year. And I saw him, and I was working at this amusement park, and Mr. Krupa was there with his grandkids. And I said, "Oh, are you here for this day? We're bringing some food out to this thing." And he said, "No, that's for old people. We're making our own food." So I always say, "Oh, Mr. Krupa, that guy's smart. He knows, doesn't matter how old you are." So I saw that book, and it kind of registered with me. Oh, I should read that. And then I read that book, and I think I read every other book that John Steinbeck wrote.
Wow.
And he wrote a lot of books.
Yeah.
And so that really kind of got me into reading. And then a job opened up at the public library in my hometown. And so that, when you're little, and most people who are librarians, probably when you were little, you read a lot.
Oh yeah, I think there's a pretty good Venn diagram overlap on that.
And but there are times in your life where maybe you're not as connected to that as you were when you were a kid.
Sure.
And that kind of got me back into it. Mr. Krupa was right, I said. This was a great book. And there was another book probably at that time I read is Out of This Furnace by Thomas Bell. Because I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I was living outside of Pittsburgh. And it's a book, I think the subtitle is A Novel of Immigrant Labor. And it's about working in the factories and successive generations. And when I started at New City, one of the initiatives we have done is creating these shelf talkers, which are essentially staff picks.
Right.
Books that we like. And so that is not a common book around here. There are only maybe one or two libraries. Probably New City and the library I used to work at own it. And but a few of us laugh and say, "You recommend that book to anybody, and everybody likes it. Nobody's heard of it," sort of a thing.
There's always books like that. I mean, something that you read at a formative time that, so many new books come out every year that it's hard to stay on top of stuff unless they really become true classics. The kind of books can disappear into the ocean, and it's a shame because some of them are wonderful and for whatever reason just weren't enshrined in the Western canon. If you want to know more about the Western canon, go back in our episode list. Dana and I did an entire episode on it, but that's awesome. I love Steinbeck as a bringing.
Steinbeck lived in Rockland for a bit.
Did he really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, if you look online, I think there's a picture of a gun permit he had.
How long did he live here? It couldn't have been that long, right? I mean,
It probably, maybe he was in the city and needed a little escape to go right at, or
because I've
something.
lived here my whole life, and I definitely read Steinbeck in high school, and I feel like a teacher would have mentioned that. One would hope, anyway. Maybe they did, and I forgot. Totally possible.
It may have also just been a very short period of time.
Right. But we like to claim that. You know, when you're a little county, even if someone lived here for about 10 minutes, you're going to tell people.
I think there was a Henry Varnum Poor connection there.
Oh, okay.
All the South Mountain Road crew, the writers and artists, and he was probably connected in some way with. And I think that is it Elmer Hader, the illustrator. They did children's books, the Haders.
We just did a whole episode on the Haders with Joe last month.
But I think the original Grapes of Wrath dust jacket was done by Hader.
Oh, that's a good tie-in. We're bringing all our episodes together today.
It's all connected.
It's all connected. That's really cool. Yeah, we did Joe told us all about the Haters, which was really wonderful. It's a great episode. So to get to the meat, as I inferred earlier, we're talking today about cookbooks and cooking in books and cooking around books. If you are interested in getting more recommendations on cookbooks, on Friday of this week, we will be doing a What's New and What You're Reading webinar on cookbooks, which is why the topic came up. But we thought we would do an episode on it as well, since Brian started pulling together so many great resources for this. And I think it's a fascinating topic. And one of the things that occurred to me as we were doing our little pre-discussion is how often cooking happens in books, and how often reading a book that has nothing to do with cooking per se has made me extremely hungry. The first thing that always comes to mind, I don't know about you, is Turkish Delight from Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which if you were an American kid in the 90s was not a food you had ever tasted. But the way they describe Turkish Delight and how it like tempts him away from his brothers and sisters, it's like satanic candy. If you've never had it, is a very interesting thing to eat after hearing about it for years.
I read all those books when I was little, but I feel like maybe when you're little, do you ever read a book prior to you fully being able to grasp it?
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's like you can read, but you can't
comprehend, right?
Yeah, I feel like I just kind of ate those books up, but didn't really understand or get or fully take on.
So I loved those books, but I was a Jewish kid, and I had no idea that they were Christian allegorical stories.
Yeah, I didn't
until like years later. Someone was like, "Yeah, you know, they were like supposed to be like religious," and I'm like, "They were." Just went right over my head. I had no clue. It's like a Jesus allegory, and I was like, "What?" If you're not raised with it, you just it doesn't penetrate. But I loved those books. But there is this whole thing about Turkish Delight, which is like candy that, if I remember correctly, tastes like flowers. It's like violets or something.
Oh yes, okay, it's coming back now. It's coming back.
Yeah, the witch tempts him, Edmund. I just like, this food has to be so good. And that was the first time I remember registering like food and cooking in a book, where I was like, clearly this must be the best candy of all time.
Recently we did, for chapters, we did a book, which maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we did Native Speaker, which is, it was some New York Times article said it was the best New York novel the last 100 years. And I said, yeah, right. But then I started to read and I was like, wow, this is good. But in it, not eating, but drinking, in it, the author is making a drink, or he's having a drink at this party. And the drink is not a Harvey Wallbanger, but a Hillary Wallbanger. Then I said to myself, oh, what kind? I was really enjoying the book, and I said, well, that's interesting. Let me look up what kind of a drink that is. So I ended up making the drink.
Nice.
Based on the book. I think it's orange juice, and Galliano. Oh, and white wine. A Harvey Wallbanger is vodka, but this is white wine, orange juice, and Galliano, which is like a vanilla-ish liqueur.
That does sound really good. I would try that.
In the
That sounds like it would be
summer,
good even without the alcohol. Like a vanilla orange. That sounds like a creamsicle.
it was pretty good.
Yeah, I think it just I think of fantasy books because that's what I read a lot of, I still do. Can be very lovingly describing of foods. And there are so many cookbooks that have come out of fantasy series, like Lord of the Rings. I know there's like I can't remember the title, but there's definitely a cookbook that pulls, all these like Hobbit recipes and lambus bread, all these things because they're described, but it's so abstracted. It's hard to know what they're actually eating. And I remember for a while with viewing parties, people would make, like when Return of the King came out, people made like Hobbit feasts to eat. That's very popular still.
Well, when I think of cookbooks and New City Library, it's hard for us not to think back to Dorothy Eng.
Oh yeah, she was still alive. It may sound like we're talking about her in the past tense. She just retired, so she's gone.
Right,
she was, but she's
but
still
in
out.
other words, her legacy as
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll never forget one day. Everybody around here, a lot of people, let's say, go apple picking in the fall, and you get all of these apples, and you're like, what am I going to do? So I started making apple crisp. And Dorothy said to me, I was telling her, what did I do over the weekend? I made apple crisp. We went apple picking. And she said, Brian, you should really make a pie. And I said, no, Dorothy, that's too hard. I can't, making a pie to me is something like my mother would make. And I could never possibly imagine doing it.
Right.
And she scribbled on a piece of paper. She said, you can just buy the Pillsbury pre-made crust, and this is what you make for the filling, and this is what you make for the topping for like an apple crumb. And I kept that piece of paper for the longest time. I've rewritten her handwritten recipe that was on one of those little pieces of paper that we give to someone that says this is what the call number of the book is, and I still have that.
Wow.
And whenever I make an apple pie, I use her recipe.
Dorothy was so enmeshed with cooking, and she collected our cookbook selection for a really long time. And it was funny too because she didn't like sweets that much, but she was such a good baker. So she would bring sweets in and not eat them herself. Really, she made really great cookies. I mean, just amazing cookies. The first year she was retired, sometimes she'd still bring us treats once in a while. So you knew Dorothy had been there. There'd be like a plate of cookies left in the staff room.
And that's really the hard thing I think about in now being in a smaller space. It was kind of like, what do we bring? What do we bring? But I meant in terms of what cookbooks to bring, because we had this kind of deep collection. And one of the cookbooks, kind of a large cookbook that kind of covers everything that we brought was the Essential New York Times cookbook.
Yes, I make brownies out of that cookbook, double chocolate espresso brownies. I've been making them since I was in high school. It's like a 20-year-old New York Times recipe that's the best brownies. And it's really just because you add like a tablespoon of instant espresso to them.
I have a chocolate chip cookie recipe that I add that to. We call them adult cookies.
Yeah, you can't give them to the kids. They'll be flying off the handle. I haven't made the brownies since like X was old enough to ask for the sweets because I'm terrified to eat them. I'll have to scrape them off the ceiling.
But I use the waffle and pancake recipe from there. I make it for my kids all the time. And it's just lots of eggs, or I think the waffles may add a cup of yogurt in there. Little changes to the recipe I had been using. Mary Phillips, who works with us, said, no, the New York Times always has too many fancy ingredients, but I found
sometimes
they have real gems.
Yeah, there's sometimes, and the cool thing is too, I will say, just to plug another library service, we do have this token that gives you 3 days with the New York Times Online. It's one of our databases, and you can search back just within the website, and you actually find the recipe, that espresso brownie recipe, which I said is like, I don't know, 20 years old. I couldn't find it one day. I used that token and I searched just in the New York Times itself. I didn't go into a database, and it did come up. So you can search backwards for recipes that way as well, which is nice because I find the advantage of a cookbook in this day and age, when you're like, oh, I can go online and find 27 recipes. If you look for modern recipes, I find the websites that have recipes on them, not the big ones like Epicurious, but the like personal ones where you find really great recipes, they have like the reason for, I even know the reason for it. I looked into it. They look like they've been malwared. There's like a ton of pop-ups, and then there's like a 42-page life story that comes before the recipe. And it turns out the reason for that is that if they don't put a story in front of the recipe is no longer copyrighted. It's very difficult to copyright recipes. You're nodding along, so you know this, but that's why if you've ever had to like scroll through like somebody's blog to get to the recipe, that's how they're making that a copyrightable thing. So if someone steals it, they can say, hey, that's my intellectual property, because you're talking about my husband and I going to the apple picking, thing before I put my crisp recipe. But the nice thing about a cookbook is you don't have to worry about any of that. It's all there. And if you get a good cookbook, most of the recipes in it are pretty solid. They've been tested, especially, I was thinking about like America's Test Kitchen. Like that's the whole point. Those recipes have been tested, and run through a million times. Those are pretty decent cookbooks as well.
We've also tried to acquire, in our small collection here, things that are one pot recipes, healthy, easy meals to make, things that are very practical.
Yes.
And Sue Teleska, who's going to be on with me on Friday, is going to show this one pot recipe, one pan recipe that just looks incredible. It's pasta with burst cherry tomatoes.
Ooh, I love a cherry tomato.
And there's goat cheese in it. So she's going to cook that on the webinar on Friday.
Oh, that's amazing. Does she have a good setup for that? Is she like ready to go?
I said, well, we do it at 4:00 on Friday. So I said, Sue, basically you'll get paid to make Friday night dinner.
I love that. We've had, a couple webinars like that, which I advise people to look out for. Danielle Adamonde, who's a patron of ours, but is also a presenter, she has celiac, so she's learned how to cook gluten-free, and she's done a couple of really great cooking demos, and they're so fun. She's so fast. She like runs around her kitchen like she's on fire. But it's she sells baked goods. She sells gluten-free baked goods to smaller outlets around the county. But I love watching people cook. Is there anything better? I think that's why we have a whole food network now.
Well, my wife has celiac, so I basically had to start baking myself because she wasn't going to bake me anything.
Oh.
And then she got jealous, so then I had to figure out if I could find one-to-one gluten-free flour that I could substitute out and make whatever I was making regular into gluten-free for her. But I always wanted to go to one of those things about the gluten-free baking. I have to find time to get to one of those.
We actually filmed a couple of them, so they're actually on our YouTube channel.
Oh,
videos.
Even better.
I don't know if they were the baking ones, but like we had winter cooking and summer cooking where she made 2 gluten-free meals. She talks about pastas and stuff because Danielle really loves pasta. So she's got a lot of recommends. She's tried every gluten-free product. That's what's great about Danielle. So she's got this really great rundown of what's good and what's not. So if you go to our YouTube channel, listener, New City Library on our YouTube, we have recorded adult programs, and that is a playlist. And in there should be winter cooking with Danielle, and I think summer cooking with Danielle is on there as well. She makes 2 full gluten-free meals over the course of about 40 minutes, and they're like doable. She does some prep ahead of time, but she does do most of the cooking on the video. It's a little shaky because her daughter is the cameraman. But if you could put up with an 11-year-old manning the camera, it's a really nice rundown of some good recipes that she has.
And another thing we're going to highlight is a book by Paul Hollywood, who of British Baking Show fame, which I binged during COVID. That was my binge watch.
It's a great binge watch.
He has a new book out on baking, and Sue actually made the brownie recipe, because I think of him and I just think I could never make one of his recipes because they're probably too complex. But she said his brownie recipe in there is pretty straightforward. So
I think they kind of amp up the complexity for the show, in fairness, because they're trying to challenge people. So I'm sure they're pulling out like the hardest bits. Because if you want to sell a cookbook, it does have to have some things that are like achievable in them.
Yeah, I'm not making choux pastry.
No, I always kind of wanted to try it, but I think that's a little outside of my skill range as well. Especially, I have a very important baking helper, as I'm sure you often do as well. So I can't do anything that an 8-year-old is going to struggle with ultimately. As it is, I do a lot of the mixing because we run out of steam halfway through.
I made apple cider donuts this past weekend for the kids.
Did you really? Did you bake them or fry them?
I baked them. I have a donut baking fan. That was a pandemic purchase.
Yeah, we all became bakers for a while. But did you make bread during the pandemic? I made so much bread.
I made bread.
Yeah, I tried to do a sourdough starter, and then it just turned out nobody in my house likes sourdough. And I was like, this is a lot of work for something no one's going to eat.
Yeah, but like you couldn't get yeast.
Yeah.
So I made scones during the pandemic.
Oh yeah.
You know, your hands are all sticky, and you know you're trying to put the butter into the batter, and it turned out good though.
I love scones. I made Amish white bread, like Amish sandwich bread. That was the bread that I made that turned out the best, and everyone in my house wanted to eat the most. I think that was probably a New York Times recipe. Obviously, it's like an Amish recipe, but I think I did find that one from the New York Times. I had old yeast like sitting around that still magically activated, which was startling. So we did manage to eat. It was that and seeds. I was ordering seeds like I was going to become a gardener. I think we were all a little worried at the time. We had no idea. It was like, it's the apocalypse. Start planting vegetables.
Well, once I found out Rockland Bakery was still open, I was like, okay, I don't need to make bread.
So if you're not from our area and you're listening to this, Rockland Bakery supplies bread, I think, through the tri-state area at this point. And it happens to be only a mile or two away from where we're sitting right now at New City Library Express. And if you drive by, they pump this smell, I think, for about a half mile in every direction. And because we do have a large Jewish population around here, on Fridays it's challah time, so everything smells like challah bread, which is such a smell of my childhood. So I just get these like waves of nostalgia and starving hunger. I need challah. It's Friday.
The pan challah. You get the pan challah and do French toast.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, see, in my household, because we had challah every Friday night, you had to make French toast with it on Saturday because it would go stale. There's no preservatives in it. So that's, it was a requirement. You had to have French bread on Saturday morning, French toast.
Yeah, I don't think they put any preservatives in their stuff.
Not traditionally. If it's kosher, I don't think it has any at all. And it's already...
I mean, even the regular bread.
Oh yeah, Rockland Bakery, probably not, because it is fresh. And the cool thing is you can go back there. It's like an episode of Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers. You can like tour the factory because they have the massive machines going, and you can walk back with your gloves and your paper bag, and you can just pull bagels and stuff as they're tumbling out of this huge industrial oven. I like to take my kid there sometimes because it's just like
a fun podcast is brought to you by Rockland Bakery.
Right. Secretly sponsored. It's kind of a monopoly. I don't think there's any equivalent anywhere near a driving distance near us. So I don't know how much they need our help. You can never get parking there. There's your con. Go find a parking space at Rockland Bakery, especially on a Friday afternoon.
So, you might be interested in just talking about like some classic recipes from cookbooks, and one of them that I have in my mind that I'll go back to usually around Thanksgiving, is the Arabian squash from the Moosewood
Oh
cookbook.
yeah,
Now, Moosewood is kind
love
of a
squash.
classic vegetarian cookbook, and the Arabian squash. So if you don't want to do just simple squash for Thanksgiving, it's got garlic and onions and peppers. So it's got some kick to it. Maybe a little, I think there's even a little cayenne in there.
Yeah, these not super spicy pepper that gives everything just a little bit more flavor, right?
But I mean, you got your turkey is kind of, let's face it, it's kind of bland. I mean, if you make a good turkey, it can be juicy, but
Right.
it's not a incredibly um, flavorful. You get something like that, you mix it with your turkey and your mashed potatoes, and you get a little kick in there. Plus, if people are vegetarian um, in your family, it can give them a little something special. But
I like that. Yeah, I like squash anyway. I always think of turkey as kind of like the thing on the plate that's like absorbing all the other flavors.
exactly, exactly.
It's like you spread everything on top of the turkey. My dad's a big fan of homemade cranberry sauce. That's like his big drive. And my mom, I wish I knew where she'd found the recipe, but she found a really good orange and cranberry recipe years ago with like big chunks of orange, and we have that every year. That might have been a New York Times recipe too. My mom for a long time. So my parents are those people who get the New York Times delivered every day. Have been my whole life. And my mom used to cut a lot of recipes out. She had one of those binders, where you would put all your found recipes. And it was a sign of the evolution of the internet, because it started out as all newspaper clippings, and the farther you got, the more printouts it was from the internet. I feel like that was one of the first things a lot of people used the internet for was recipes. That I feel like that was one of the really early things that and directions. It was like MapQuest and Food.com were kind of the early things.
Yeah, I still use the internet for certain recipes.
Yeah.
Even if I know I got it from a book, if I want to access it quickly, usually you may be able to pull it up if it's a popular one.
Yeah, and I think I just tend to have my phone on me more than I'll have a book in the kitchen, to be honest. So if I have to check a temperature, what does this need to be cooked at? I won't lie, that's my go-to. I did so many years ago, speaking of the library and cookbooks, when I got married, I had just started working here. I'd been here about 6 months, and our mutual boss, Marianne, threw me a wedding shower, which was super nice. And somebody bought me The Joy of Cooking. I think that's the first cookbook I ever actually owned, um, which I do use. There's a lot. I know it's like an old standard, but it's an old standard for a reason. Especially if you're just looking up like, how long do I cook this chicken for? Like, it's really good as a reference text.
The reference.
Yeah. I've never used it myself, but I will say, speaking of cookbooks and reading, I do love how much people go back to Julia Childs and the art of French cooking. And I actually just discovered a guy on YouTube. I mean, he's been around for a few years, who's going back and doing the old Julia and Julia experiment. And watching him cook these dishes is really inspiring. I'm like, oh, maybe I'll do this one day. I do want to try. I would want to learn a little bit of French cooking, because it is elaborate, but the food looks so good.
Have you read or heard of Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat?
Yes, and I watched her Netflix show. Oh, what's her name? I don't want to get it right. She did like a 4-part Salmon Nosrat. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Salmon Nosrat. But she did like a 4-part TV series, which was really sweet. I really enjoyed that. And what a good breakdown of what makes food taste good, which, recipes don't often talk about. They're instructional, but they don't tell you about like basically the chemical reasons why food tastes good. I remember because I went to Rutgers. There's actually a pretty big food science department at Rutgers, And that was the first time I read about the fact that like snacks are engineered to make you keep eating them, which makes total sense, but who thinks about? And there's a whole field doing exactly what she's talking about in those books, talking about salt and fat and acid and heat. And if you think about like hot Cheetos, which are so popular, has all three, right? It's a little salty, it's a little acidic, it's a little fatty and greasy, and it's got heat. um, and what makes you keep compulsively eating something. And crunch is a huge, there's like a science of crunch.
Well, that's like the whole thing. Is cooking an art or is it a science? I feel like with salt, fat, acid, heat, if you understand enough of the science, you can be more artistic in the way you cook.
Absolutely.
In other words, if you understand these key elements, you can then substitute other ingredients out in your cooking that give you different flavors, by understanding those key elements and how they work.
I mean, even going back to what you're talking about right at the beginning with the Hillary Wallbanger, understanding what makes a Harvey Wallbanger appealing to somebody gives you the ability to substitute out an ingredient and play with it. If you have a good base and a good understanding of what makes a good drink or a good cookie. I've been making, so this is not from a book, but my chocolate chip cookie recipe has always been the Toll House recipe on the back of the Nestle chocolate chips, because it's a very standard but very good chocolate chip cookie recipe, and it's quick. And then I watched, I don't know, 150 tasty videos during the pandemic. And the one consistent thing I saw with all these like upscaled cookie recipes was brown butter, which is not actually all that hard to make, but it does change the flavor of anything you're baking. Have you ever browned butter?
No, no, what is that?
So it's really not hard. You just heat butter up on the stove and you cook it. You have to keep an eye on it so it doesn't burn, but you cook it until it literally browns, like the butter itself. It goes clear when it melts to an extent, and then it starts to brown. And you'll know you're at the right stage because it actually starts to smell sweet. It smells like kind of almost toffee-ish, and it gives a toffee flavor to whatever you put it in. And you can even let it re-solidify if your recipe calls for like a less, if you can't use melted butter in it.
See, like whenever I have a recipe that calls for butter, I usually microwave it, which is probably everyone's probably like, don't do that. But
I
this
do it.
is
I
probably
microwave
like
butter all the time.
the fancy way to get that butter melted, but maybe keep or create a certain flavor.
Yeah, so you're actually bringing it past the melting point. So it's not just melting it on the stove. You kind of keep cooking it, and depending on what's going on, it can take a little bit. I think the first time I made it, it took me longer because I was just like not sure I had gotten it to the right point. You don't want to boil it. You want it to be hot though. So you're like simmering it, and it's hard to it's easy to it caramelizes basically. You're almost like caramelizing the butter essentially. You just have to watch it to make sure it doesn't go too far and burn.
Right.
But it basically turns the butter brown. That's why it's called brown butter. And it's like a caramel toffee tang that it adds to a cookie. I don't usually have the time to do it because obviously it adds time to the recipe, and especially if you need it to cool back down. Because I've learned over the years, if you put like super melted butter into cookies, you better like a thin cookie, because the cookie kind of goes smoosh, which I prefer actually. But yeah, if you want to cool it back off, obviously. But it retains that taste even if it's cooled off. And it's just one of these things, you just kind of, if you kind of have your recipe down, you can be a little bit more experimental.
You know what you should check out is the Neiman Marcus chocolate chip cookie recipe.
That's
the one I use.
Yeah.
Have you used that?
I don't think I have. Because I'm very basic. I've been using that Toll House recipe. I don't even buy Nestle chocolate chips anymore because of
it's brown sugar. You use brown sugar instead of the granulated sugar.
Like entirely? Because the one I use.
Wow, there's just a few tablespoons of granulated sugar, but it's a cup of brown sugar.
Oh, okay. So it just changes the ratio of brown sugar to white sugar.
And then you cook it very a lower temperature, like 300.
Low and slow.
350.
I could see that. Yeah, I'll have to mess around with that. I've also started like refrigerating the dough because that does make a difference. I used to like really resist that, but the longer you can leave something in the fridge, like cookie dough, the better it comes out. It just does because the flavors just swoosh. But usually I have a hungry child who wants cookies now, so unable to do that for too often, unfortunately. Did you have any other prime recommendations that you want to throw out?
No, moosewood, the Arabian squash. I think if you want something that is, um, in terms of a book that gives you a little philosophy, I think that salt, fat, acid, heat is
Yeah.
is great.
And it's newer, which is nice because a lot of the like solid reference texts of cooking are quite old. And it's nice to have like an updated idea, which kind of reflects modern cooking more and is definitely more multicultural. When I think of like Joy of Cooking and Julia Childs, it's very monocultural. Um, and I think one of the joys of cookbooks is learning a whole new region's cooking style if you can find them.
I read a couple books on talking about that sort of thing on Anthony Bourdain, and of course, there's a new book, kind of The Dirt. But I really enjoyed his Kitchen Confidential.
Yeah.
I certainly have never worked at that high level of cooking, and he went to the Culinary Institute, etc.
Yeah.
But I worked in some fast food joints that were pretty busy.
Kitchens are busy, I think, at any level. It's a very intense job.
And it's that kind of, camaraderie and kind of rough and tumble sort of a environment to work in. I know there were days that I went to work and then I left and I felt like I had just gotten there.
Right.
It was so busy, you just worked yourself to the bone, basically.
I haven't watched it yet, but I know there's a really highly rated show on Hulu now called The Beast, which is about working in the back.
No, that's The Bear.
The Bear, that's it.
I watched that. Yeah,
Did you like it?
Yeah, that sort of a feel. Anybody who's worked in a restaurant, and the main character there is actually a big time chef, but his family owns this Italian beef kind of local joint that everybody loves in Chicago. And then he comes back to run it, and he's trying to keep the kind of regular feel of it, but also elevate it in a way.
Sure.
So I thought it was a good show, kind of dark.
Yeah, it's on my to watch list. A lot of people were raving about it. But I think there's always an interest in cooking and literature, and I mean, it's such a big part of our lives. And I was thinking about it as we were talking because I'm going to do an episode with Nancy and Karen on cozies and sweets for December. And if you're not familiar, cozy mysteries are mysteries where they're pretty bloodless. There might be a murder, but it's like off screen. And generally, the person investigating them is not law enforcement. They tend to be like a shop owner or a hobbyist of some kind. And there's a bunch of these where cooking is a big part of it because it takes place in a cafe or a restaurant. And there's usually recipes at the ends of the books, which I always find very delightful. There's a series that I think is all named after muffins, and there's usually a muffin recipe at the end. There's a series which I've never read, but I love the titles. They're all tea shop themed. My favorite title was Oolong Dead, which I think is like the 10th one. And those usually have little charming recipes at the ends too. So you can find stuff in the oddest of places if you look for them.
Yeah, those are really popular. I'm thinking of a particular patron right now who always asks me for them.
Yeah, I think there's something really cool about that. And I think it goes to, the thing about a book that is challenging often is they're trying to describe experiences that are hard to capture, like smells and taste. Sight and sound, I think, is easier. But it's very hard to like write out how something sounds and how something tastes. So I always think it's really interesting when you get a recipe included and you can go try it for yourself. Um, I was very big into Anne McCaffrey's Pern series as a tween, which are all about dragons and all sorts of stuff. But they were forever drinking something called calf. They were always drinking calf, which is like, if you read any sci-fi or fantasy, it's very big to have like essentially coffee, but you call it something else, just like money is always called other things. But I was so intrigued by this as a kid, and there was like a Pern reference book that she put out, and one of the things in it was like a recipe for calf. And I remember like, I have to make this. I have to know what they're drinking constantly. It was like coffee and I think hot chocolate or something like that. But I think about that all the time because you're trying to get that sensory experience from a 2D page, right?
Yeah, like I said, when I hear a drink or something is made in a book I'm reading, I always kind of think, you want to experience that too, the way the character is experiencing it.
What I think about with drinks? I know it's not quite a book, although it was based on a book, but how Cosmos became so big after Sex and the City's first season, because that was all they drank. And you could go to any bar and order a Cosmo, a drink that no one had had since the 20s. It was this like really old-fashioned cranberry-based thing. And I remember my mom wanting to try Cosmos because they made them look so good on the show. And it became like the most popular. That and I don't know if that also came from Sex and the City, but at the same time, Appletinis too. Like they were both
2 parts vodka, 1 part triple sec, and a splash of cranberry.
Is that the Cosmo recipe? So you've made them. You have it off the top of your dome, huh?
And Appletini is probably 2 parts vodka and 1 part apple liqueur.
Yeah, they were green. Appletinis are usually green. I don't know why they're green apple instead of red apple. I think because they're a little sour. But I think about that all the time, what an influence it can be on food. Like foods have fads, which I think is kind of delightful. Do you have any closing thoughts, Brian? Any last food thoughts you want to share with our podcasting audience?
No, come to the webinar on Friday.
And if you missed the webinar, all our What's New and What's Reading are recorded. So those are also available on our YouTube channel, usually within the week of their production. So if you're curious about that, that will be live on Friday. You can register through our website, newcitylibrary.calendar.com.org, or you can watch it on our YouTube channel within a week. We will also have up there shortly the recording I did with Karen Ostertag, who was our last guest host, talking about all kinds of horror titles, from the mild to the you will never want to sleep with the lights off again. Karen rated them on Fear Factor, which I thought was very funny. I also contributed a few titles to that one because you all know I love horror. So you can watch that. That should be up hopefully by this Wednesday on our YouTube channel as well. So thank you so much, Brian, for joining me today.
Thank you, Veronica, for having me.
And have a lovely week, everybody, and read on.